everyone. Great to be here with you today. I'd like to begin by asking you a question. Imagine that you were home alone one day and had, say, 15 minutes to spare. You weren't nothing pressing for you to do. And how might you choose to spend that time? Some of us might read a book, exercise, perhaps catch up on our email, maybe watch a little TV. But the question I will address today is, why don't we spend that time just thinking? And by that, I don't mean meditating as much as filling up our mind with pleasant thoughts. After all, we have this huge brain that is stocked full of pleasant memories that we could recall, or we could spend our time thinking about the future and things we're looking forward to and anticipating. We might construct fantasies that we find pleasurable. And yet, it seems that people rarely choose to do this kind of activity of just thinking, or at least not that often. So there's three questions that I want to address with you. Is this a difficult activity to just think? Why or why not? And is this a good way for us to construct stories or narratives about ourselves that lead to a sense of purpose and well-being? It's clear that this ability to withdraw from the external world and focus inward for prolonged periods of time is a uniquely human ability, as illustrated by Rodin's statue, The Thinker. It doesn't appear to be something that our primate cousins can do. And that's why pictures like this are kind of amusing, that it's rare to see an animal withdraw from the external environment and just focus its attention inward. It's clear that this is a highly valued activity throughout human history. All cultures place a value on contemplation and turning inward. All cultures have places where people are likely to do this, monasteries, retreats. And the major religious leaders of the world, the Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad, all went on treks of contemplation, in their case, for spiritual reasons. But if you just look around you as you commute to work or go about your daily activities, it doesn't seem to be an activity that we choose to do in our daily lives that often. When people commute, they often are listening to music or reading the newspaper. Even when we drive, which is a time we could spend in contemplation, too many of us choose to do other activities, dangerous ones like texting. This picture is of the Charlotte, North Carolina airport. It's a place I happen to fly through frequently. And they have this nice array of rocking chairs with windows facing the tarmac, and they're often full of people waiting for their flights. And when I walk by there, I often just count how many people appear to be engaged in something, such as reading or listening to music or talking, versus just thinking. And the latter is quite rare. It's not very often that I'll see someone who appears to be just thinking. As illustrated in this New Yorker cartoon where the nurse comes to the waiting room and says, "We're running a little behind, but we'd be happy to have our anesthesiologist put you under for a few hours." I fear that some people might accept that offer. There are data on this. So there's something called the American Time Use Survey, which is conducted by the National Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they take a random sample of Americans and phone them and ask them in great detail exactly what they've done the previous 24 hours. And they have trained coders who take what people say and put them into categories to see how Americans spend their time. Now, the first thing about this that interests me is there is no category for just thinking. It doesn't appear to be one that was common enough for them to include it in their scheme of what people do. There is one called thinking relaxing, which is broader because it includes things like relaxing with another person, which I wouldn't put into the category of just thinking. But even in that broader category, most Americans don't report having done any of this in the previous 24 hours. We've recently done an experience sampling study with college students where we texted students 4 times a day for a week at random points during their day. And they were instructed to, when they got this text, to notice exactly what they had been thinking about, and then to answer a few questions about their thoughts. Things like, were you focused outward on the world or inward on your own thoughts? Had you done so intentionally or not? Is it something you wanted to be doing? And by looking at the answers to these questions, we came up with this category which we call deliberate reverie, which is any time people reported that they were focusing inward on their thoughts on purpose, and they wanted to be doing so. It seemed to be an enjoyable activity. And it wasn't that rare. About 8% of all thoughts fell into this category, and 71% of the college students reported doing it at least once. So I don't want to argue we never do this, but it doesn't appear to be something that is all that common. Now, a question that has come up in this conference, I think, is technology to blame for this? Is the fact that we all have phones at arm's length somehow responsible for our lack of willingness to just think for prolonged periods of time? And I suspect, oh, well, here's a picture that you can go on Amazon or somewhere and buy this device. This is a potty chair, for those of you who have toddlers, and it comes with a bracket where you can put an iPad into it so that as your toddler is learning how to use the potty, he or she can stay connected. And I don't know. But I want to suggest that technology is not completely to blame, that maybe this is just an activity which is hard. There are many wise people over the ages who have complained that people seem not to spend enough time thinking or contemplating. And one of my favorite quotes is of Blaise Pascal, that all of humanity's problems stem from man's or woman's ability to sit quietly in a room alone. So we've conducted a series of studies that I want to summarize for you here that decided to look at this very simple question of whether people find this an easy thing to do and how much they enjoy it. So in our studies, we bring people, well, we do it in a variety of settings that I'll tell you about in a second, but people are asked a simple question. For the next 3 to 15 minutes, depending on the study, we want you to just be alone with your thoughts and try to enjoy yourself. Quite simple. Some of these studies are done in our psychology department lab, where people are brought in, we take away all their devices, any cell phones, pens, anything they could use to distract themselves, and they sit in a room that is unadorned, no pictures on the wall, and they're said, just think. We've done some studies where we allow people to do this at home. So first they come in and get some instructions, and we tell them, we're going to send you an email with a link to a survey, and please open it only when you have, say, 30 minutes to spare, you don't feel rushed, and you agree to be by yourself and to put aside all your technology. We've done this primarily with college students, but we have some data from community members ranging in age from 18 to 80. Well, here's what we find. First, people don't report after trying to do this that it's not particularly easy. Now, of course, there's some range on this. It's not true of everyone. But I would say on average, people report that it was hard to concentrate on your thoughts during this short period of time. When people do this at home, they admit to us afterwards that they couldn't do it. Many people do. About half of our participants say, yeah, I have to admit, I looked at my cell phone, I grabbed a pen and I doodled, I browsed the web. They said I just couldn't last the 12 or 15 minutes. Many report it was not that enjoyable or somewhat boring. And another question we ask people is about their use of technology. How often do they have a smartphone? How often do they use it? And at least in our studies so far, we do not find a relationship such that as the people who use technology a lot who are the ones who are not enjoying this. There is no such correspondence, which is part of the reason I suspect this is a more fundamental problem. And in one of our studies, we simply randomly assigned people. This was one of the ones we got people do at home. And in one condition, they were in our Just Think. They went through that procedure where they got our instructions to spend 12 minutes just thinking. But in another condition, they were asked to do something external, to choose from a list of everyday activities to fill up this 12 minutes. So common things like listening to music, reading, working on puzzles, whatever they chose. And so we were interested in how this stacked up in comparison. Did people enjoy just thinking more or less than common everyday activities? And the results were pretty stark. This is a 9-point scale that goes from I didn't enjoy this at all to I really, really enjoyed this. And you can see that the yellow bar, that those who did the external activities said this was pretty cool, yeah, it was fun, around a 7. But those who were asked to just think, much lower, between 3 and 4. So this got us to wondering whether, if it appears that people get bored so easily with their own thoughts, is it possible that they would actually prefer negative stimulation to just thinking? And so we did a study, this was with college students, where we brought them in and we gave them a sample electric shock. We asked them for their consent to do this, and everyone agreed. Now, I want to stress, this was not a really strong shock. It was given by a 9-volt battery, and it was not like sticking your finger in a light socket and having your hair go up. All of the researchers involved in this, including myself, took sample shocks to see what it was like. And I would describe it as kind of a severe static shock. I mean, you do get a little jolt, and it's not very pleasurable. We asked people, suppose we gave you $5. How much of that, if any, would you pay us not to have to get another shock? And on average, people said, well, I'd give you at least $1 or $2. You know, that was not a very pleasant experience. So then we put them through our just think procedure. Said, okay, now we want you to sit in this room by yourself, take away all their technology, and just think, try to use your own thoughts to entertain yourself. And oh, by the way, we say, the shock button's still there, and the electrodes are still attached to their ankle. And we say, if you want, you can, you know, it's still active, you could push it, but really, what we'd like you to do is to concentrate on your own thoughts. Now, I have to tell you that the research team that did this, myself included, were rather split on whether this study was even worth doing. I mean, some of us felt, really? I mean, they just told us they'd pay us not to get another shock. Why on earth would they give themselves another shock, especially when we have this storehouse of great things we could think about, and it's only 15 minutes. Others of us said, well, you know, our earlier studies did tell us that people are pretty bored with this, and maybe external stimulation is better than no stimulation. Well, we found that especially men did shock themselves. 2/3 of our men shocked themselves at least once. Only about 1/4 of women. Now, this gender difference is a little bit of a mystery. There's some evidence that men are higher in sensation seeking, but you'll see in a moment that women will shock themselves under some conditions as well. On average, men gave a range of 0 to 4 shocks, women 0 to 9, an average of about 1. Now, if you read my little note at the bottom, you'll see that I've excluded one outlier. We did have one participant who shocked himself 190 times. Now, when we saw those data, we were rather worried about this guy, but we also thought, well, you know, maybe this battery is not regenerating its power quick, and maybe he didn't really get shocked 190 times. Well, I have an intrepid research assistant who said, a woman who said, I'll volunteer to find out. So she sat there, she got shocked every time. So I'm not sure what's up with this one guy. Now, since our study was published, another one came out by some other researchers, and they did it a little bit differently. They had people watch a documentary film for an hour. In one condition, it was a pretty interesting documentary. It was about the Nobel laureate Eric Kandel. It talked about his life and his discoveries. In the other, it was a quite boring documentary. They took an 85-second loop of Eric Kandel playing tennis and showed it over and over again. So you see Kandel, he hits the ball across the net, his partner returns it. Oh, okay. Hits the ball across the net, his partner returns it again and again and again. And they also were given the opportunity to shock themselves as they were watching this video. Now, this is lasting for an hour, mind you. Well, even the interesting film, about 40% of the people shocked themselves at least once. Maybe Eric Kandel's life isn't that interesting, but when they saw the boring film, almost everyone. Now, I left out an important detail. This sample is almost entirely women. So even women will shock themselves out of boredom if you bore them enough, I think is one thing of looking at this. Now, What intrigues me about this is if you're watching this boring film, there's no reason you can't just retreat in your mind and enjoy yourself with your own thoughts. And once you catch on that there's repetitive things going on over again, why don't people say, this is a great opportunity for me, see, there's this party coming up, or I'll think about my dog, or, we have this huge brain. And yet people seem to not be able to use it that well and to shock themselves instead. And I will also add, so you see that the number of shocks in the boring film was an average of 22. And unlike our study, the participants here were allowed to choose the intensity of the shock. In our study, it was around 2 to 4 milliamperes. 6.8 milliamperes is fairly severe shock, and that's the average that people chose to do. So why is this? Well, I think one reason is that our mind evolved to engage in the world. After all, our big brain's purpose, largely, is to engage. It's to look for opportunities, to avoid dangers, to connect with other people. William James has this quote that thinking is for doing. And he suggests that the brain is not designed just to shut out the world, it really is designed to engage in the world, as it is with other primates. And I think another thing about our studies is this is hard to do deliberately. All of us at times have pleasant daydreams and idle thoughts that we're kind of enjoying, but usually it's something that happens to us. It's not that we say, okay, this is daydream time, okay, starting right now, here I go. And I think that's an issue with our studies as to why people don't report that they enjoy this all that much. It's just hard to turn it on. It's something that happens to us. So I would suggest that we enjoy our thoughts, but perhaps don't force it, allow it to happen. And I do think this is one reason why meditation is attractive to many of us, that it gives us the mental control to be able to do what we want with our thoughts, to notice them, let them go by, dwell on them. But without that ability, it's apparently pretty hard to do. But I want to close with a few thoughts about whether this is a valuable activity, independently of how much we enjoy it. That if our goal is to live a happy and fulfilled life, to have stories about ourselves that are flattering and purposeful, then should we be doing this kind of thinking? This is a photograph here of the poet Theodore Roethke, who wrote a verse I've always liked, that self-contemplation is a curse that makes an old confusion worse. And if you look at that picture of him, he seems to kind of practice what he preaches. And he doesn't look like a terribly happy guy. And it may be that at least in some kinds of contemplation can perhaps not add to this ability to tell good stories about ourselves. And I think this is consistent with the messages of some prior speakers who've talked about compassion, that often that's a matter not of looking inward, but of looking outward, of engaging, helping others. It turns out the literature on happiness suggests that one of the best ways to feel good about ourselves and to feel that we are living a purposeful and meaningful life is indeed to help others. And there's nice evidence on this. One of my favorite studies is one that was done with at-risk high school students. In this particular school, there was a very high teenage pregnancy rate, a very high failure rate in courses, so researchers thought, how can we help these kids? Well, they devised this program where some of the kids were randomly assigned to do volunteer work in their community. This was done as part of their health class. They were asked to spend at least 2 or 3 hours a week in a social agency of their choice. So some chose daycare centers, some chose old folks' homes, and many of them put in more than the 2 and 3 hours. They enjoyed this activity. There was a control group that did not do the volunteer work. Now, you might ask, what does doing volunteer work have to do with being an at-risk teenager? Well, if we think of this in terms of people's narratives about themselves, often at-risk teens have the narrative of feeling that they're not engaged in their community, that they don't feel part of this world. They feel that they don't have a stake in what's going on around them. They feel alienated. Well, one way to change that story is to connect them, to put them in a situation where they're helping others. They feel like they have a stake, that they are worthwhile people by looking at what they are doing. And the results of this study were dramatic. The green bars are those who did the volunteer work, the yellow bars, the control group who did not. and it cut the pregnancy rate of girls in half, and it also cut in half the percent who failed academic courses. Now, I teach at the University of Virginia that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, and it's almost obligatory in any talk given there to quote Mr. Jefferson in some way. I will say it gets a little tiresome sometimes, but I will end with some quotes from TJ. And one thing he says is that, do you want to know who you are? Don't ask. And I would amend that for saying, don't maybe focus inwards too much. Act. Action will delineate and define you. I believe that every human mind feels pleasure in doing good to another. Thank you very much.